it's Jo from Minerva. Today we're going to do a sew along of a waistcoat, and today our focus for technique is on pattern matching. The pattern is Simplicity 4762. It's got some different styles of waistcoat, one with a collar, one with welt pockets, a double-breasted version, and there's also a tie to make on there. It comes in adults and children's. So today I'm going to make the children's waistcoat because it's easier to show you a smaller version on the frame. The fabric I'm using is a green tartan. It's got some quite dominant lines that we can work with for pattern matching. It's not too thick for children's wear. You could also make a winter dress, a pinafore, a skirt. It's got a really nice feel to it. And this is what we're going to use to make our children's waistcoat. Other items you'll need are matching thread. I've got one for areas that might show, one for in the insides. You'll need some iron-on interfacing for stiffening the front panels of the waistcoat, and a lining that will match the back of your waistcoat. So you've got the green and the grey on the front and the grey lining on the back. And you will also need some buttons, and I've decided to make some self-covering buttons so that I could get a really good match. You will also need a buckle for the little adjustable strap on the back of the waistcoat. All those are listed in the products below, so if there's something there that you think, oh, I've not seen that before, you can click on it and add it to your basket. You can also hover over one of the items and all of the items will go to your basket, and you can delete as necessary. I'm going to make view C, which is a single-breasted waistcoat with welt pockets. And I've got a mixture of pattern sizes here, so I'm going to make the boys medium. So I'm going to look for those pieces corresponding on this list here with the boys medium from the pattern pieces. The first thing I've done is to trace off my pattern pieces from the main pattern, because I want to show you a few things that you can do to the pattern piece to help you pattern match when you start to cut the fabric. So I've cut out, this is the front waistcoat piece, and I'm going to mark the seam allowance all the way around. I'm going to use the width of my tape measure because my tape measure is 1.5, or you could use a seam gauge or a ruler, and I'm going to mark on the seam allowance all the way around, because when we're pattern matching we have to allow for that seam allowance. So we're not going to, the cutting line and the seam allowance are really important, because if you cut your fabric here, then the piece that matches up won't match on the cutting line, it will match on the seam line. So I'm going to keep going round and I'm going to keep adding the seam allowances so that I've got a very accurate place to do my pattern matching, which is on the seam line, not the cutting line. So we've got the front piece, and now I'm going to cut out the two front pieces and decide where I'm going to have my pattern. The fabric is only in a single layer, because if you try and cut in a double layer, they will shift a little bit. You might not have it quite lined up properly. So it takes a little bit more time, but it's a good idea to cut it out on a single layer. Also, depending on the gauge and size and scale of your tartan, you might find that you need to order a little bit more material. I've got plenty here, but to match tartans and plaids, sometimes you need a little bit extra fabric, because you might be then scooting over here a little bit and not using up this piece of fabric in the middle. So also on the pattern, so I've marked the seam allowances, I've also put the notches on, because the notches are a good indicator of where you're going to get particular parts of the pattern. So on this fabric, I could say that I would like that white line to hit the shoulder notch, so that when I do it on the other side and I flip it over, I can match the shoulder notch with the white line also. I've got something else to consider on this pattern, and so will you, which is that there's a dart here. So if I did pick that white dominant line that's running here and matched it up with my shoulder seam, I would actually lose that white line within my dart. So that's probably not a good choice. I probably need to have something a little bit more anonymous that will get sucked into the dart and it won't alter the pattern too much. So you can start to think about major parts of the pattern on the fabric. So I can see here that I've got this white line running here, and that matches with the side seam. So I'm going to keep that as my horizontal. And I've got the white line that I just spoke to you about on the shoulder, but I've just took it away from the notch a little bit so I don't lose it in the dart. So I've got a horizontal and a vertical reference point, so it intersects there. So I've got this main black bit on the shoulder. And I've also got to match up, get my grain line a little bit straight. So I want to make sure that my line here is matching up with a line up that I choose off the fabric. So you need to make sure that where your fabric is going to match isn't on the cutting line, it's on that seam line there, not this one here. So that's where you're going to imagine that the centre line of your waistcoat is. I'm going to pin that down. I might draw around it so that I can flip this over, because you need to make sure that you then make an opposite piece, not a piece that's the same. And then we're going to see if we can get two identical fronts. Also, you're going to have a little bit of an overlap where the buttons go. So remember, your waistcoat isn't going to butt up exactly. So you've got to make sure that you don't pick a dominant line that you might lose a little bit. So I've picked this no man's land sort of lighter colour here as my centre front. And then I've got the darker lines definitely on the jacket. I'm cut out. You can see I've chosen quite a plainish bit to be near the button band, and I've picked that really thick dominant one to go on the shoulder. And now I've got to try and do the same by using these little notch marks and for this white horizontal line. So because you're cutting on a single layer, you've now got to, this was your first piece, so you've now got to flip your pattern piece over, or you can use your first piece so that you can make sure that you're matching up the dominant line. So I've got this black line that's going to run through the shoulder on one side and on the other side. I've got this white horizontal line that was marked on my pattern. I've matched that up, and I've made sure that along the bottom there it's matched up so that when we make darts we've got the same amount of pattern excluded once the dart's made. So I'm going to cut out the second side. Just so that I don't make any mistakes when I sew it together, I've put 2 safety pins to show me that this is the right side. So the safety pin's showing, that means it's the right side for me. But I've got this dominant line here and here, and I've got a nice horizontal running across here. This pattern matching technique can be used if you're cutting out some skirt pieces. So say you're making like a pencil skirt with tartan, you can find that side notch, your hip notch on your pattern, draw a line across, and then you can make sure that you pattern match a particular dominant colour or pattern on the fabric with your hip notch, and then when you cut out your back pieces you can also look for that same place on the hip notch. If you've got a grain line on your pattern piece, it's also good to match that up, so you can make sure that your grain line is running straight on a straight line of your tartan fabric. So those are my pattern matching tips, and now we're ready to cut out the rest of the pieces. Okay, the back piece asks for a pair to be cut in lining and a pair to be cut in your outer fabric. Now, if you're a beginner, you could cut 4 in lining and you could have your waistcoat with the tartan fronts and linings on the back. But because I'm trying to show guys a few bits of pattern matching, and I want to try and show you how to pattern match the sides and the shoulders. So we're going to do the same as we did on the front piece. So we're going to find that shoulder notch, match it up, and then I'm going to draw on where I want those 2 white dominant lines. So it's a bit tricky to see, but there's the 2 white lines that I used last time on the shoulder. So I've marked those on. Then I'm going to use the side notches. So I've got a side notch. I'm going to line that up, and I'm going to have those white horizontals there. And I've got the white horizontals on the bottom, and I'm going to have my white horizontals here. So I've used the front piece to take the notch marks and match up the pattern so that I will get a continuous block of this thick line running over the shoulder, and I should have this horizontal dark line matching at the side notches. Again, don't forget you're cutting on a single layer, so you're going to have to flip this over and find your markings again, and then you can cut out your second back piece. Right, it's a pretty epic cutout, but even for a small boy's item, but to get all that pattern matching right, it's a really good skill to learn, and you can carry that skill into some other garments, winter dresses, pencil skirts, matching the front placket on a shirt. So it's really worth learning that little notch skill. So you should have 2 front linings, 2 front interfacings, 2 fronts, 2 backs, 2 linings, 2 welts, 2 interfacings, and 2 belt pieces. As with all sew-alongs, I'm going to read the instructions just as if you were, so that you can cross-check anything that you're doing. The first step is to stay stitch along this front edge, and the seam allowance is 1.5, but if you stay stitch, that means within that 1.5 seam allowance to sew 1 single layer of stitching, and that stops this neck stretching out because it's cut on the bias. I don't want to stretch it too much, but that's cut on the bias, so we don't want that to stretch out, otherwise these 2 front pieces here will start to flop forward. So we're going to stay stitch the 2 front edges, and the same for the back neck. So we're going to do a row of stitching within the seam allowance around the back neck. No special setups for the machine for this, a normal needle, your Gutterman thread, and we can start to sew. Step 2 is to add the darts. So they are on the front pieces, and we added those with a chalk line before. So we are going to make sure that we've got the wrong side of the fabric. So remember, I put a safety pin to show that that's the right side. So I can pinch up those broken lines from the inside, pin the dart, and just a quick dart review. So we're going to sew from the pin's in the wrong side. We're going to sew from the wide end to the narrow end. We're going to do a few air stitches at the end, a few stitches that just go off the fabric. And we're not going to do a forwards and back motion. So we're going to start at the wide end of the dart and come down to the thinner end, So we can forwards and back at the beginning. Gradually start to go out and go really, really slowly towards the end, and just let those last 2 stitches not be on the fabric at all. Have nice long ends, and then they're easy to tie off, so you'll get a really smooth point to your dart, not a little bubble at the end. So you should have a dart that comes to a smooth end, and that'll need pressing. And you can remember that I had that dark line there, and I wanted to make sure that that dark line remained sort of on that shoulder seam. Okay, because we're not making the waistcoat with the collar, we're going to skip to stage 7, which is to add the interfacing to the welts. Again, because this fabric doesn't have an obvious right or wrong side, just make sure that you're making 2 opposite welts, not 2 the same, and you can easily trim off some of this interfacing if it's just poking out, because you'll need to be pretty accurate with welts when you put them on the welt markings. So we've applied the interfacing. We're now going to fold the welts in half lengthways with right sides together and pin. The seam allowance is slightly different here. We're going to sew across the ends here with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. And we just need to make sure that we seam gauge that out, because that is how we will get the right size to fit on the welt marking. Okay, so you can sew your 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then I'm trimmed off some of the seam bulk. There's not much with 1 centimetre, but I want it to have nice crisp corners, and then you can turn it out the right way. The seam gauge is perfect for that. It's got a pointy corner, so it's really good for turning out collars and welts, so you can get a nice edge. And same on the other one. So you've got nice points on each side, and now I'm going to machine baste along this raw edge 1 centimetre from the edge, and that's important because that's going to have the right placement. And that's what you want. 2 welts the same size, and then they're going to be opposite like this. Okay, the welts line up with the line that you had from your pattern piece, and you line up the base line that you've just made with the chalk line. So make sure that you don't line up the raw edge with the line. It's definitely the base line that needs to be lined up. Make sure your welts are pointing downhill towards the center, and then we're going to sew them on and flip them up. The base line that you made before is going to be the line that you follow. So We're going to follow that basting line to attach the welt. We're going to trim off the excess. So that we can fold them up. So you trim off the excess without cutting a hole in your waistcoat. And this is all the same even if you make the adult version, so it's the same technique. It's just easier for me to show you on a smaller piece of fabric. So they're like a faux pocket welt. And then you're going to press that so that you've got a pocket welt. I decided to hand slip stitch down my welt pockets because I'm working on such a small scale that I thought top stitching would be a little bit obvious as well. It was a case of, do I choose a grey or do I choose a green top stitching thread? So I've just hand sewn those down on the edges, and then you've got that little faux welt pocket. Number 10 is to attach the two back pieces together, and this is where you're going to start using some of your pattern matching skills that you had in your cutting out to make sure that you get those together. You need to make sure that you've got the right side showing. So there's the right side. We're going to put the right sides together, and then we're going to match up the back seam, and we're all the way along we're going to be matching up those parts of the pattern that we used. I'm not going to sew off to the end. There is a small dot at the end, and we're going to go forwards and backwards to reinforce that. So we're going to sew this back seam, and then we're going to attach the fronts to the backs along the shoulder seam, and again we're going to be matching the pattern that we chose as our main feature, that white line. So we're going to make sure that those shoulder seams are pattern matched too. And you will finish on that dot there. I've just marked it with a chalk, and I've just put a pin in. Sew down there with the 1.5 seam allowance, and I'm going to forwards and backwards at the end. You should have some nice shoulder seams with your lines matching, and you should have the centre back with these horizontals matching. And now it's time to find the placement for the belt on the back. Fold the belt pieces right sides together, and then you're going to sew up one end and along, and the left belt piece is a little bit longer than the right belt piece. So make those up, turn them back the right way, push the corners out, trim any seams, and this has got a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Okay, I'm going to find the belt markings. So there's one there and one there, and same for the other side. There's one there, one there, and then I'm going to stitch, make sure the ends are nice and flush. I'm going to stitch that down on those markings and then fold it back on itself and top stitch. So I'm going to stitch the raw edge between the markings and then flip it back on itself and top stitch. Okay, you're going to fold over the right hand side, so that's the smaller of the two belts, by 1 inch through the belt loop, should be able to see the front of the buckle. It's got like an embossed sort of wave shape on it, and it's recessed on the back, so you should have the embossed wave shape showing. So the outer waistcoat is complete. You can see all the workings and gubbins, so it looks a little bit messy at the moment, but now we're going to do the same processes with the lining. So we're going to apply the fusible interfacing to all of the lining pieces. We're going to sew them at the shoulder seams, we're going to put the darts in, and then we're going to put the two pieces together. So I'm not going to go through all of the sewing the lining together because it's the same process as the outer, but then I'm going to skip to the part where we put the two pieces together. I've got the lining pieces and I've got the front panels interfaced. The back isn't interfaced because that needs a little bit of movement to pull the belt in, and it's pinned now all the way around the neck edge, down the button front and along the bottom. The bottom with the little kick split in has all been pinned, but we're not going to sew the side seams because we're going to use that for turning. I've just used my tailor's chalk to mark that V shape on the back because when I sew I want to keep the 1.5 seam allowance, so I just want to make sure that I get those tips and those points will be in the same place. So I'm going to sew all around and then we can turn this out through the side seams. Okay, the waistcoat is all attached. I have just overlocked around the edges because just where I've been handling the fabric a little bit more, it's just started to fray a little bit, so it's not critical because it's all going to be enclosed on the insides, but it just stops it fraying out to the seam. If I show you on the reverse, we're going to snip these corners, so we need a bit of fabric handling technique now. So we're going to snip the corners, clip the curves on the neck, and then we're going to get ready to turn it out. So we've got the main waistcoat all attached, the outer and the inner lining. Okay, so to turn it inside out, you're going to pull each of these fronts through the shoulder seam. So I'm reaching through, I'm going to pull through one front through the shoulder, like that. And the other one through the other side. Put your hand through the side seam, you wiggle your fingers up through the shoulder seam, and then you can pull the front waistcoat panel through the shoulder seam. In the side because you haven't sewn up the side seams, and you can do a bit more fabric handling to make sure that all of the points are pressed out, and then that needs a really good press. I'm just going to press all of those points. So we've got a little point there at the front chest, another one here at the bottom of the chest, at the bottom of the button band, and I'm just wearing my silicone fingers because I can get really close to the edge of the fabric and I can make sure because they've got a little bit of grip on, I can make sure that I can roll the outer fabric over the lining, because I want the lining to be at the back and I want the outer fabric just to roll over the edge a little bit. So these are silicone finger guards, and they're really good because when you touch the fabric, even after you've steamed it, it doesn't feel too hot. And you can hold your fingers really close to the tip of the iron, and you can use the friction or the traction to roll the fabric over. It's a very delicate action, but it does make quite a difference. To join the side seams, you're going to put the outer fabric right sides together and match up your pattern, which you did the donkey work for early on because you had really good cutting skills. So you're going to match up those side seams, and then you're going to keep rolling that seam round so that you can match up where the lining and the fabric join. And you're going to sew a little bit of the lining as well. So you're going to go 2 linings together, all the outers together, and you're going to keep doing the same. It's quite tricky to hold the pins in because you're going to essentially sew from here round to here. So it's tricky to get under the machine. It's very tricky with pins in. So I'm going to tack that and then I'm going to sew it under the machine. And I should have left open a little opening that I can flip out, and then I can hand stitch down the last bit of the seam allowance. So that's the opening there. And now you can just hand stitch those down with some black thread. And then we have the buttonholes left. But we have that really nice continuity of that horizontal stripe running around the sides of the jacket. And that's from our pattern matching that we did earlier on when we concentrated on that side seam notch. Last stage is to mark 4 buttonholes along the centre front. There is a button band piece in the pattern, so you can use that. I've sort of spaced mine out myself. They're 4.5 centimetres apart. I'm going to make buttonholes on the left one and then sew corresponding buttons on the right front. So the left goes over the right front, and then the corresponding buttons go underneath. That's the waistcoat complete. I used self-covering buttons. We've got that really nice balance of the tartan on the front, and we've got the horizontal stripe running across the back and around the side seams. So if you would like to have a go at making Simplicity 4762, I made view C, which is the welt pocket. It's the more casual version here. So you could make it in a needle cord, you could make it in any wool blend suiting. If you wanted to make a smarter version for a prom or page boys, for a wedding or for a special Christmas Day outfit, then you could use a jacquard, you could use a cotton poplin, you could use a taffeta. So there's lots and lots of different choices, and not all of them will require that amount of pattern matching, but that was today's tutorial just to show you a few of those tips. So hopefully you've enjoyed yourselves. If you've got some questions, you can put those below and we can reply to your comments. If you've made a waistcoat yourself, don't forget to upload it on Minerva and use the hashtag waistcoats. Or if you've used Simplicity 4762, you can use the hashtag Simplicity 4762. Thanks very much for watching. Come back soon.